Story 1. I don't see any feasible way for people to become candidates without us knowing their identity. If we didn't know their identity, how could the media investigate what they have done in their lives? Story 2. It's not like they are obligated to be truthful in what they claim their beliefs are. I would rather see as much as I can about them and make my own judgment than just what they want me to hear. Story 3. I don't particularly care about names, parties, gender, race, and religious information. It's really not a factor. I'm fine with whatever. Just tell me you're the person for the job. Let me know where you stand on the issues and what the plan is if you get elected. However, I do care somewhat about a resume. For example, if you held public office, what did you actually do during that time? It would be incredibly difficult to provide that background without someone easily looking up who did it. In most cases, it would cause all the desired unknowns to become known. It somewhat defeats the purpose if I actually gather enough background on what the person has done to determine if they are a potentially suitable candidate for office. It wouldn't be hard to figure the rest out, and people would do that. Even if I tried not to know, there's a decent chance I would accidentally find out if I didn't already know from their resume. The main point is that I think it's unrealistic for people to vote that way and still know enough to determine who to support. This isn't just about the listed factors, but also because it is easy to find any of that information once you know enough to assess if a candidate might be suitable. Then there's also the question of honesty. If I can guarantee that they're likely to do what they say, mostly backed by previously held offices or jobs, I'm fine. Without a way to really know how honest the opinions are, it's hard to understand which way to vote. Ultimately, I need to know the person's background, which inadvertently will provide me with most of that information. This is aside from the practicality that our entire system is set up by two parties where we mostly just vote between the candidates. It would likely be obvious from what was said which party they lean toward, even if I didn't do any other research beyond listening to their stance on the issues. Story 4. Stripping away the names and parties would help us focus on what the candidates believe instead of who they are. It would reveal how often we vote based on this. You might discover that the candidate you agree with the most does not belong to the party you prefer. Story 5. The main issue is that individuals might express whatever they believe will garner them the most votes, only to act according to their own agenda once elected. However, I think this could lead some people to support the opposing side, and I believe this would likely be a larger percentage of right-leaning individuals compared to those on the left. Overall, I suspect this would have a net positive effect by shifting more votes toward the left. Story 6. Except how would I know where they actually stand on issues if I cannot see their history? If I can't research them, then they can easily lie to get votes from everyone. There are still plenty of people who do research on who and what they are voting for. Story 7. Sounds fine as long as the data includes how frequently they have succeeded in fulfilling policies and what the data is. Politics should ideally be boring. I'm Australian and we use a website reasonably frequently to see what candidates do. We mostly do not care about religion. There are also a large number of sites where you can input your policy views and see who matches you the most. Story 8. This is a bad idea. We need to know who they are to understand what they have done and what they are likely to do. Story 9. The phrase used to describe your title is identity politics. It puts false limits on how we form our opinions and prevents us from understanding what candidates say and forming independent opinions about them. Many of us are aligned with our party, which detracts from our ability to choose the highest quality candidates. We also use identity politics to fuel anger and hatred toward each other. I cannot simply disagree with you. I have to hate you because you're aligned with the other party. You can see it happen all the time. People express strong negativity when they engage in identity politics with one another. It brings out the worst in people. It is unfortunate. Story 10. Background is important. Good ideas are one thing. Actually understanding how the government works and having work experience in government is another. Story 11. That is a poor idea. Who is monitoring their honesty regarding their stance? Just look at what is happening right now. Story 12. If only they wouldn't lie. They conduct polling to see what the popular positions are and then claim those are their platforms for the ballot. It would result in a completely random vote because everything would sound the same. Story 13. I am more interested in knowing who their sponsors are. It is a valid point. Make them display their donors' insignia like race car drivers do. Additionally, a significant portion of the adult population is functionally illiterate. If their vote is based on just a paragraph of text, they will be completely lost. Asking them to compare and evaluate paragraphs is unrealistic. Story 14. How they stand on the issues is only part of what makes them a worthy candidate for your vote. Their leadership ability, debate skills, knowledge of world politics, and general demeanor also play a significant role. There are other traits I am missing, but you understand the point. Story 15. It would be beneficial if it was completely honest and affiliations could not be changed. With the number of candidates who run and win, then switch parties, I am guessing that we would see a lot of that. Story 16. I don't see it as feasible, but it would be a massive progress for everyone. People would start voting on the ideas rather than the person. Ideas are what truly matter. Story 17. On paper, it sounds great. No more downline voting. In practice, you need to understand their voting trends, actual behaviors, and affiliations, because they may not be truthful to gain votes. They must be able to clearly explain their policy beliefs and plans, which requires effective communication. You cannot call out a lie if there is no way to discern that they are lying. Story 18. I wish presidential races were determined by a standard text form where candidates state their stance on each major issue, line by line. Posted on an official federal website, everyone can compare the documents as they please. Any edits or updates are clearly time-stamped. No videos, no pictures, no rhetoric or sensational debates. Perhaps a few long-form town halls where they take questions and provide clarifications directly. It should be as straightforward and factual as possible, without politics as entertainment. Some people argue that candidates would just lie. They already lie to pander to their respective media bases. In fact, most of what they say is just empty rhetoric. The theatrics do not add any additional credibility. Story 19. I do not like it. I would not bet on a horse like this either. We could be voting for a candidate pretending to align with one side, or we could be voting for someone on their last leg. I want to see the determination in their eyes and if there is any honesty on their face when they make those promises. Spud Duckplug fails this miserably. He comes across as a false promise, a mere placeholder in person. Story 20. That would work well if they actually followed their policies and did what they said. However, they do not, so we need to assess them based on their character and history. Story 21. That sounds nice at first glance, but they are either easy to identify or they lack accountability. They can claim their stance aligns with popular opinion, but if they act contrary to that, it may go unnoticed by most, allowing them to repeat the same deceptive behavior. This situation already affects many voters, as most do not pay close attention, but it could exacerbate the problem. Story 22. I agree with my position on most issues, but I would personally make a terrible president. Story 23. On one hand, this sounds nice. On the other hand, if the nominee was convicted of 34 felonies, bragged about sexually assaulting women, was accused of raping children, and had a close relationship with a sex trafficker, I would like to know that. A system where you only know their political views does not allow for that kind of knowledge. Story 24. I wouldn't trust them, but it's not like I trust current politicians much either. Not knowing anything about them means we have no idea how likely they are to follow through on their campaign promises. We wouldn't know how easily they can be manipulated, their education or experience, or how well they could handle new problems as they arise. At the end of the day, most democracies rely on voting for individuals. If we lack information about those individuals, we are no longer voting for people, just a handful of issues. Story 25. My votes likely wouldn't change. I primarily vote based on a small, specific set of issues, so I already do this. Story 26. You could unknowingly vote for a candidate with a history of serious offenses who lies and commits fraud regularly. They might not even need to deny it. We may as well have a series of public votes and run the government according to individual policies if you're not going to vote based on the candidate. I'm sure one candidate does not fit everyone's perspectives, but at least voting on individual policies allows you to have more of a say. For example, what if you support the death penalty and abortion rights? Not many candidates align with those views, so you often have to choose the lesser of two evils. Without knowing the candidate's background, the situation becomes even more challenging. Story 27. Isn't it just about policy that Donald Trump won the 2 elections he did? He could have been anyone, even an inanimate carbon rod. But the Democrats failed to listen to anyone but their wealthy supporters and completely lost touch with ordinary people, so voters chose policy over identity politics. If the Democrats had focused on presenting a candidate who ran on something other than being the first in any category, they might have won. Perhaps in the next election, they should completely disregard race and gender when selecting a candidate and listen to their base to choose someone qualified. Story 28. Many issues could be deferred to referendums because they are simple yes or no questions. Abortion is a great example, as are gun control, cannabis legalization, immigration, and trans rights, almost all of the hot-button issues of today. So why are politicians involved in these matters? Politics would be much better if more issues were deferred to referendums where people could vote directly. Politicians could then focus on higher-level issues, such as guiding the overall direction of the country. Currently, voters must navigate a complex array of issues and candidate matrices to find those who align with their priorities. Why not allow the public to decide on issues directly while politicians concentrate on more significant matters? Story 29. Candidate A. Avid painter who did not complete art school. Former soldier and veteran. Advocates for revitalizing the struggling economy. Author of a memoir. Story 30. But then all you are left with is the lies they tell to get elected, the misdirection, and the misinformation. Story 31. People are too stupid to listen, or maybe too dumb to determine what a politician is really about. It will come down to TikTok or X, or whoever puts out the best propaganda and what their favorite internet celebrities tell them to vote for. Story 32. The problem is that you would only know what the candidates claim to believe, with no way of judging whether they actually believe it or how likely they are to follow up on those promises. It would be easy to promise a bunch of popular policies, get elected, then not bother enacting them and instead use the time to enrich yourself and your friends before leaving before the next election. When you know a candidate as a person with a history, you can at least attempt to judge their reliability and whether their claims match their past actions. Story 33. People are brands, and America will always vote for the strongest candidate. There is no point in having your country's greatest diplomat not be selected based on their image. I don't support Reagan's economic policy, but his urging Gorbachev to tear down that wall was iconic. People look to the person in power as an indicator of confidence and trust in the nation. Unfortunately, like blind men feeling an elephant, different groups of people will perceive different qualities. Story 34. Everyone claims to stand for what they believe will gain votes, regardless of their true intentions. An actual mechanism would be needed to compel them to act as they have stated, which is not feasible. Story 35. I believe elections should be publicly funded, with all candidates receiving the same stipend for campaign spending allocated as they please. For issues, there should be a single form that candidates fill out with uniform questions that gets posted on a single easily accessible government website. National surveys should be conducted to gauge which specific issues are most pressing for voters, and the top-ranked ones should be included in a questionnaire that each candidate answers. People are concerned about inflation. What is your economic plan to address this concern? The country is concerned about national debt. What specific steps would you take to address this issue? Americans are worried about housing affordability, consumer protection, climate change, gas prices, and other significant issues. What specific actions would you take to address these concerns? Then, every person has the ability to view a uniform presentation of questions and answers and compare candidate positions side by side. There should be no misleading voters about the opposition's policy positions. They should all be public information presented next to each other's. No dodging questions. If a candidate does not answer a question, it will be apparent when voters read the answers and compare them directly to the next candidate who did respond with specific details. There should be no excuses such as, "This person didn't have a plan," or They didn't convey their positions well enough. Everything would be on the forms. All information addressing major issues would be consolidated in one easily accessible location. Candidates can then use their publicly allocated funding to focus on these issues in whatever form they choose, within the same budget every other candidate has. As long as private interests have such an outsized role in funding candidates, candidates will be beholden to their donors more than the voters. The system needs to remove private money from the equation. Private donors can still contribute, but funds should go to a public account to be dispersed among candidates selected through the primary process. I am unsure how to implement the who gets to run portion, but we absolutely need organization and uniformity in how campaigns are run. Story 36. I would be fine with it. That's how I identify most of these individuals anyway. The person with anti-child agendas, the one, he's a man-child who has had 3, maybe 4 wives, and he talks endlessly about family values. He cheats at golf and plays a lot of golf, and it's his only redeeming quality. It would actually be worth some government expenditure for humanity to pay this individual to keep playing golf, even at $5 million per day, even if he complains about spending that much on transgender issues. Nope, I don't even need a name. Story 37. Voting should require you to take the side with quiz first. You can vote for anyone, but you must take the quiz to see who you match up with best before voting. Story 38. In theory, this is nice, but in practice, I think character matters too much as well. I wouldn't be able to tell if they were serious about the issues they claim to support, if I felt confident they could actually achieve their goals, if they could negotiate and interact with other world leaders effectively, or if they could handle a crisis. Policy is obviously important, but there is more to being a leader than just policy. Story 39. That is a great way to find out only after the fact that you voted for someone with a history of corruption or domestic violence or similar issues. Who the candidates are is just as important as where they stand on the issues. You are electing these individuals to represent you, and that goes beyond just how they will vote in the legislature. Story 40. Given that the candidates would align with the party platform, I don't think it would make a significant difference. We would see conservative talking points and realize the candidate was a Republican, or slightly less conservative talking points and realize they were a Democrat. It would be a pretty safe bet that both were white men. Considering that politicians need to be public figures, and their rank, reputation, and maneuvering are strong predictors of presidential runs, it wouldn't be too difficult to make a solid guess as to who the candidate was. The waters would get muddied by discussions about certain issues. A good number of people wouldn't vote for fear of an undesirable demographic behind the curtain. They would vote Democrat, but they can't risk a black woman being president. It's too emasculating for fragile egos. There would be significant streamlining of political platforms and positions. Most people wouldn't take the time to read the entire write-up, opting instead for brief snippets and short videos to form their ideas. Story 41. You say that person is close to nobody, and being nobody is like air. Just think of that person as non-existent. Story 42. Since we cannot know if someone is lying and cannot judge how likely they are to be lying based on past records without knowing their identity, this system would be worse than what we have now. Story 43. I wish a computer were in charge. No ego, no personality, just a program designed to do its job. Story 44. I wish politicians would provide direct answers to questions instead of talking in circles. Story 45. One needs experience. For example, I completely agree with my stance on various issues. However, I would not vote for myself because I lack the relevant experience to accomplish tasks. Story 46. I like how, in the United Kingdom, they vote for a party, not a prime minister. The party then selects the prime minister and can remove them. It is not completely anonymous, but I feel it puts more focus on policies rather than personalities compared to how we do it in the United States, where Kamala Harris's laugh became an issue and the Republican Party's electoral victory was driven by Donald Trump's personality. Story 47. Reminds me of a thought experiment where 3 candidates are described: Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, and Adolf Hitler. The way their accomplishments are presented without using names often leads you to choose Hitler every time. Story 48. Reminds me of that thought experiment where you hear 3 candidates described: Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, and Adolf Hitler. The way their accomplishments are presented without using names leads you to choose Hitler every time. Story 49. I personally think there is something more important than policy positions. Character. I see what you're getting at, and I fully recognize that too many other people are influenced poorly by other aspects of a candidate. I believe that the most important qualities of a candidate are empathy and a willingness to change their mind when faced with new information. That's exactly how President Biden was able to be one of the most progressive presidents in decades. If you look at his record before his presidency, it is not that impressive, but on the campaign trail, he demonstrated a willingness to listen and learn, leading to some positive outcomes. Unfortunately, that willingness did not extend to the Israel-Palestine issue, where there seems to be some deep-seated prejudice that needs to be addressed, but you win some, you lose some. Story 50. I oppose it. I want to see and hear the candidates speak. Charisma matters. Additionally, I would like to at least be able to read the candidate's biography to ensure we are not electing known serial killers. Story 51. How would we know their stances? Would we trust their statements? What if two candidates had identical statements? What about actions? If someone was a serial killer whose views on taxes matched yours, wouldn't you want to know about the murders? Story 52. There should be consequences if individuals lie about their positions. I also strongly disapprove of those who switch political parties. They should be required to resign and not be permitted to change parties. Story 53. The information provided is not nearly sufficient. While it may be adequate for a representative, the president's role involves more leadership and less focus on policy. Decision-making, trustworthiness, diplomacy, and many other factors are just as important as policy positions. Story 54. As good as it may seem, this idea is very flawed. If a person is dishonest about their stance, it would be easy for them to deceive others, as no one could conduct background checks. Although there may be some advantages, some individuals have misrepresented their true political party to secure enough votes for election, only to later change sides. If they are anonymous enough to do this, how would people know for sure if a candidate has done terrible things? How would they prove it was that candidate? I doubt this would be feasible. I have heard this theory before, but with how unpredictable people can be, they could figure out and expose the candidates. These are the flaws with this concept. However, if it were successful, I believe it could lead to less division and less propaganda against specific candidates, because how could you provide evidence of wrongdoing? How can you fabricate claims about a candidate you do not know or have seen? Sure, people might attempt this based on policies, but I think it would be significantly less than if candidates were visible, resulting in fewer conspiracy theories. Another aspect of elections is getting to know the candidates. I do not mean on a personal level, but enough to create a connection. Without this, we would have less of a relationship with our future leaders. Story 55. That seems unrealistic, but we need a way to neutralize charisma. Charisma is the significant weakness of democracy. As we are seeing now, someone with enough charisma can ruin everything. Story 56. Honestly, I don't understand how an election can take place without knowledge of the name, race, or gender of the candidates. However, I support eliminating political parties and voting based on platforms. In all honesty, I do not care about the gender, race, religion, or sexual orientation of a candidate. I want to vote for the candidate who makes the most sense, rather than voting out of party loyalty. Story 57. Half of all Americans would not know whom to vote for due to a lack of understanding of the issues. Story 58. It is challenging to understand their position without knowing some of their background. Putting family first and strengthening national security can mean very different things to different groups. Story 59. Someone suggests voting for a party platform, and then they appoint a leader. The party can remove them if they underperform, which is reasonable. What I believe we should implement is that every candidate has a poster at the polling station listing 5 of their platform promises. Before voting, you must correctly name 3 promises for each candidate who historically received a certain number of votes. This requirement would prevent parties from running an excessive number of candidates, making the process unmanageable. There is no need for extensive study. It would simply be an open book test on the candidates' positions. This approach would only work for elections for a single position. In places like the United States, where you vote for numerous candidates simultaneously, this method might not be feasible. Story 60. This is called party platform voting, and it's common in other democracies. You vote for a party rather than a candidate, and then the party elects one of its members on your behalf. It's exclusive to a parliamentary system and could be considered the defining feature of such systems. It often works better, especially in multi-party systems. First, fix the skewed representation in Congress, then have them elect the leader to form a cabinet and enact the platform. To meet your original specifications, just make the election nonpartisan. Much like Nebraska, it will be clear which platform belongs to which party. But there it is. Select one platform for the new government. Story 61. If there is money in politics, it would not matter. It would still be lies to hide their real allegiance to money and power. Story 62. All of them stand everywhere and deliver whatever they want, rarely doing what they promised. So how does this help? Story 63. I love that idea. If all we knew about presidential candidates was where they stood on the issues, it would change the game. No names, no parties, no personal aspects, just pure policy. It would make things less about picking sides based on identity and more about actual plans and solutions. We would look at what they want to do and whether it makes sense. No distractions. Imagine how much easier it would be to focus on what matters. You would not have to worry about the other noise. Story 64. I think it would be beneficial to have a summary of past work experience for a job that's significant. You need to understand their history and how they have performed in other roles. Story 65. How would you prevent people from simply stating false information to meet requirements? While individuals can still be dishonest, conducting research allows for making an informed judgment. Story 66. Like the television show Married at First Sight, it looks great in theory. However, most people's biases, triggers, pettiness, old habits, and histories begin to surface, skewing the purity of the decision. This proves, once again, as my stepfather would say, that people are just not good. Story 67. I don't think it would work. Promises are made during the campaign that candidates have no intention of following through. For example, Australia is approaching an election. Both parties are making promises about housing affordability. However, the leader of one party has voted against, I believe, every housing affordability measure that has been introduced to Parliament. There is no reason to believe that he will stick to his word based on his past history. I'm not a one-issue voter, and I will look further into candidates and parties to see their history, but I can only do that by knowing who the candidate or head of the party is. Story 68. You can even forget where they stand on the issues because that is subjective. It can be conveyed poorly and misunderstood. All you need to properly judge a candidate is their voting record and their proposed bills. That's clearly stated. Examine every vote they made on every bill to understand their position and how they might have evolved over time. Review every bill they proposed or co-sponsored to see the types of issues they are willing to take a stand on. Story 69. There was a poll I saw online in the early 2000s that was exactly like this. You read through a series of statements and ranked your agreement with them on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest. They would tally the results and then reveal the candidate you selected along with their responses. The poll provided direct, quoted answers from each politician with sources for their comments. The candidate chosen for me in 2 consecutive elections was not someone I would have been drawn to, yet I ended up voting for them anyway. Story 70. I would prefer a psychological profile. I want to understand this person's character, not just what they promise or present, or any issues they might claim later that prevent them from completing tasks due to opposition. It's easy to tell people what they want to hear and then make excuses. I want to know if they care about constitutional values and the welfare of citizens. Story 71. I dislike this idea. I genuinely care about the character of the candidates I vote for. Talk is cheap, and I trust my instincts more than a politician's word. Implementing ranked choice voting would resolve many of the current system's issues immediately. Story 72. Setting aside the factors that make this practically impossible, The issue that remains is how we can know that the candidate actually acts according to what they promised during the election. Story 73. That would not work. It is important to know what these individuals have done in the past and how they behaved in order to make accurate judgments about how they might act in the future. Story 74. I prefer not to know who is running so we can vote on electors as the United States system was designed to work. All this distraction is how demagogues are created. Story 75. People can say anything, especially when they are anonymous. A candidate could be fighting his whole life against something but claim that he supports it just for the votes. By knowing who he is and what he did in the past, you can guess what his real thoughts are. Story 76. How would you feel if a candidate could just say anything their constituents wanted to hear, even if it was just lies meant to gain votes? Story 77. I think this is an amazing idea. As it stands, it is just a high school popularity contest. The same applies to resumes during job hunting. There should be no name, address, or personally identifying information, only qualifications and credentials relevant to the position. Story 78. I really think it would be great. Focusing solely on where candidates stand on the issues would encourage people to evaluate them based on their policies and ideas rather than being influenced by their identity. Story 79. Politics involves the negotiation of interests rather than management. There is no single solution that works for everyone, and different individuals have different desires. The great insight of democracy is that this is acceptable. Political parties serve as a primary method of aggregating interests. What are the issues? There will not be agreement. However, let's consider the candidates' stated intentions. New problems will arise. What actions will they take? Party identity provides some answers. In a personalized system, we can evaluate candidates based on their previous actions. If that information is excluded, we are essentially asked to accept a set of election promises at face value. In presidential systems, a candidate's identity is one of the most important pieces of information. Suppose two candidates claim to support a particular policy. One has been advocating for it for 30 years before it gained popularity, while the other does not genuinely support it but has adopted the position because opinion polls indicate it now has backing. Clearly, simply stating where they stand is insufficient. Story 80. Adding to this, reduce their salary and then give them bonuses or penalties based on performance. You promise to fix roads and actually get things done? Large bonus. You promise to provide clean water to Flint, but it's still toxic? Salary reduction. Story 81. I agree with the no parties aspect as I believe the party system combined with human nature significantly contributes to the degradation and fall of democracies. A legislative branch where everyone from one party votes the same, regardless of their beliefs or those of their constituents, is doomed to corruption and worse. I think the entire party system must come to an end. I disagree with hiding the other elements you suggested, though I can appreciate why it has been proposed. I just don't think it's reasonable to hide who you are voting for as president. Story 82. I do not care where they stand on issues. That should not matter. They should represent the will of the electorate. I would vote for the person who has the best plan to determine what the electorate wants and is most likely to legislate accordingly. Story 83. No offense to the original poster, but was this question written by artificial intelligence? I am noticing more and more politically driven questions on AskReddit. The answers often feel robotic as well. Story 84. I have long said that if we did this, the Republican Party as it exists today would simply not exist. Do not tell me that both sides are the same. It is the fastest way to show that you do not pay attention to politics. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.